So at this point, I would welcome Representative Sarty to the podium to introduce his bill, an act to provide municipal oversight and authority over groundwater extraction.
I have to give you a little background before I get into the actual substance of my bill. It's been 4 years ago this month, as a member of the Board of Selectmen in Denmark, a large-scale extractor found its way into Denmark with the interests of extracting large quantities of water from our aquifer. Having the experience of watching the controversy in an abutting town of Freiburg, the Board of Selectmen decided to immediately try to seek out some assistance from the state and made several phone calls to see what was available. And unfortunately, at that time, now this is 4 years ago, there was very little. So we decided to seek the advice of an independent expert, and that was very difficult. It took quite a while to find a firm not connected with the bottled water industry, and we eventually did that. Jakes Whitford in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. We retained the advice of a professional hydrogeologist to work with the Board of Selectmen, along with the town's attorney, to come up with some means of dealing with what was an issue of great public concern. Working from that to make what is a very long story as short as I can, we worked on this as with the approach of research indicating an existing law that was on the books, which is primarily the bill I have before you, that allowed a Board of Selectmen to establish a water regulation. That regulation by statute would only be good for 1 year, after which it would require the ratification of the voting body of the community if it were to continue. However, the section itself, the law itself that you have before you, was somewhat inadequate, and what we've done here is we have amended that somewhat to include subsurface water and to authorize the board not only to immediately pass a water regulation following an initial public hearing, but to take an additional year if necessary in order to develop a water extraction ordinance. It's a very complicated process. We worked on that intensely in Denmark for approximately 14 months. This is an issue that has attracted a great deal of public concern, and rightfully should. To us, our approach, especially with the lack of assistance that existed 4 years ago on the part of state government, we've taken the position and have stayed with that position that this issue is best decided at the local level through the local voting body as to what's going to happen to the resource that is immediately theirs in their perception. This bill does not prohibit large-scale water extraction. However, what comes from it is very limiting as far as what that can actually do. And I'll pass this out to the committee just for your own reference, and when you have a chance you can read it. I'm certainly not going to now. It's the end result of this law that's before you now, offering the time necessary to the local jurisdiction to formulate a water extraction ordinance. It's 12 pages long. It's full of conditions and oversight that involved a great deal of public disclosure. We held 6 public hearings, inclusive of 2 special town meetings and 1 regular town meeting.
Is this it?
Yeah, the top page might not be necessary, but that is it, yeah, okay. And it was quite a daunting process. And I think what we're seeing throughout the state now in certain key areas are a great deal of public reaction to the issue of large-scale water extraction. However, we have to recognize that each venue has different circumstances. In Shapley Newfield, the land in question was owned by those 2 towns. In Wells Kennebunk, we're talking a local water district. In the town of Denmark, the land is actually owned by the extractor. These variances, depending on which situation we're discussing, can require a great deal of change in outlook and circumstance when developing an ordinance. I agree with Representative Schatz. In fact, Representative Schatz and I spent quite a bit of time talking together about our bills. We've discussed them in Rural Caucus. We've had a lot of testimony from state officials who since have indicated that the state has upgraded its oversight in groundwater extraction. I believe the most significant change occurred in 2007. And if you look back at the history of this issue, in 1989, I believe the Maine courts dealing with an issue that addressed large-scale water extraction really basically pleaded to the state legislature to address this issue, and it did not. Again, in 1999, an additional circumstance occurred where the court again suggested to the legislature it look at the issue. And so here we are now. I believe we have about 11 water bills in front of this session from various angles and representing different circumstances. And if anything else comes of this, I think it's a wake-up call to the state legislature where we do have to deal with this. Having gone through the experience myself as a municipal official and taking into consideration the strong sentiment of local folks, I do feel that this ordinance ultimately should be administered at the local level where the local people will have some say. And the sense of this is that this is their water. We've worked out through a 12-page ordinance that's been passed out to you what we feel is an acceptable set of standards to allow water extraction to occur in our town. This is, however, a work in progress. At this point, no water has been pumped, and yet there's the second renewal of a permit to do so was just issued a few months ago. The reason there hasn't been any water pumped is they're waiting for a lawsuit to be settled in the abutting town of Freiburg, which would influence that project. But I think the important thing to remember here is if the state is finally going to step up to the plate, and very recently we found that there are conditions and new policy changes where the state will have a great deal more input. However, I think it's important to recognize how important this is to the local jurisdiction. So I think the task of the state legislature, this committee, and probably state and local and others, will be to sift through this and try to come up with a policy that will satisfy Maine people that their water resources are not threatened and that there are possibly areas where we can look at large-scale water extraction and through current data, current science and technology, consider whether we can accommodate that industry. That, to me, is the significant issue. But obviously, public input is a critical requirement when we deal with this. And I think that can be better handled at the local level. Any questions?
The basic foundation on which the town acted was not the existing state statute, but the overriding home rule rule that we have in the state. Is that correct?
To a degree, I think that is correct. The old statute that we use basically opened the door for the board to pass immediately a water regulation that gave us time to develop a more detailed ordinance. It was not a pleasant way to go because we weren't confident to the degree of 100% that the statute intended to cover what we did. However, it was not, that portion was never legally challenged, which is why we're asking for an amendment to the statute which would take that risk element away in the view of our situation.
The Maine law treats them differently. Maine, if it's a large body of water on the surface, it belongs to the people. The moment any of it seeps underground, it becomes absolute dominion owned by whoever happens to own the property it's under. And so therefore, the public ownership of the resource once it's underground is viewed differently in the law, as I understand it. And what I understand your bill to do is say, okay, we have more authority over this groundwater than we previously did if we pass this law.
Absolutely.
Okay. Now, I guess my first question is, do you think the current law is protective enough?
My name is J.K. Pratt. I'm the Denmark town attorney. To a large extent, I'm the guy that drafted the ordinance.
Mr. Pratt, could you just repeat your name for everyone listening outside?
A. Kingman Pratt, Jr.
Thank you.
from Freiburg. I just have two comments. First of all, Representative Duchesne's absolutely correct.
Here's one.
Existing state law does not give, and clearly doesn't intend to give, to the vote of a majority the ability to prohibit water extraction by the owner of property above the aquifer. The courts begged you to revisit the question and consider a comprehensive reworking, if that you see fit, of Maine water policy. But in the face of that existing law, to pass a statute that say towns may, on an ad hoc basis, prohibit, is not statewide water policy. That's passing the buck. Representative Sarty's bill recognizes the tradition that has prevailed lately of passing the buck and says, let us take an existing statute, tweak it, and clarify that towns to whom the buck has historically been passed anyway